Our deep dive today is into the 105 days of the Winter War.
It truly is a frozen nightmare that history often overlooks, or maybe just simplifies. To really grasp the scale of the audacity and, the conflict itself, you have to place yourself right there.
Where are we?
Imagine the vast, unforgiving Finnish forests of Karelia. It's November 30th, 1939. The temperature is just plunging past minus 30, sometimes touching minus 40 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
And that cold, it isn't just uncomfortable, it actually weaponizes the landscape itself.
And through that stark, white, and often silent terror comes the sound. The sound of overwhelming industrial might. You hear this low, vibrating rumble of steel tracks.
Yeah.
What we're witnessing is the Red Army of the Soviet Union, the largest army in the world at the time, crashing across the border. They have amassed, over 450,000 troops, at least, and supported by upwards of 3,000 modern tanks, thousands of aircraft. I mean, the scale is just enormous.
Now, contrast that, just put that against Finland,
Yeah.
a nation of just 3.7 million people. Their entire military strength can barely muster maybe 150,000 men.
If that, initially. And their equipment, they possess perhaps 30 obsolete tanks, mostly relics from World War I, almost museum pieces.
Right. And they have the resources, the ammunition to fire maybe a handful of artillery shells for every 1,000 the Soviets are unleashing.
It looked like a military and logistical impossibility for them to survive, let alone, actually win or even resist effectively.
Exactly. And Joseph Stalin, orchestrating this assault from the Kremlin, he was utterly convinced this would be, trivial, almost an administrative walkover, as the sources put it.
Yeah, he thought it was done.
His initial orders suggested a 3-week operation. Just secure a strategic border position near Leningrad. He expected a quick forced parade into Helsinki, not a desperate war. But what the Soviets really failed to fully account for was this lethal combination of Finnish tactical genius, the unforgiving, almost roadless geography, and maybe most crucially, this deep well of national spirit the Finns call Sisu.
Sisu. It's a word we hear a lot with this conflict. It's often translated simply as grit or determination, maybe perseverance, but it feels more profound than that, doesn't it?
It really is. It's that stoic, grim tenacity, almost a survival mechanism that acknowledges total disaster is possible, likely even, but just refuses to yield. It's stubbornness elevated to a national virtue.
That refusal to surrender, that core belief, that's the engine of this entire deep dive today, isn't it? Our mission is to explore how that spirit, Sisu, combined with, frankly, a radical military doctrine born of necessity, exposed the fundamental catastrophic vulnerabilities of this supposedly unstoppable Red Army.
And in a terrifying twist of historical irony, inadvertently gave Adolf Hitler the confidence he needed to greenlight Operation Barbarossa. The echoes are huge.
Absolutely. So let's start with the motivation, the seeds of this conflict. We need to look at why Stalin decided to strike, and why then, in late 1939. On the surface, it always comes down to security, doesn't it?
Always. But in Stalin's calculation, that security was driven by, pure obsessive paranoia, especially about one city.
Leningrad.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is how geography dictated the timing and the fear. Leningrad wasn't just a major city. It was the very cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, sacred ground, symbolically.
And it's at a mere 32 kilometers, about 20 miles, from the pre-1939 Finnish border.
Yeah. For Stalin, even a neutral, non-threatening Finland felt like an unacceptable strategic gun aimed squarely at the heart of his regime. He couldn't tolerate that proximity.
And this fear, this paranoia, it was magnified hugely by the geopolitical landscape of 1939, the rise of Nazi Germany.
Right. Even though the Soviet Union had just signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact a few months earlier in August, that cynical, secret treaty that basically carved up Eastern Europe between them.
Poland being the immediate victim.
Exactly. That pact actually made Stalin frantic to create a deep ideological buffer zone. He used that agreement as cover, securing his western flank with Germany temporarily neutralized, allowing him to immediately turn north and demand, as he saw it, a little security from Finland.
But the demand wasn't little at all, was it? It was humiliating, and for the Finns, practically impossible to accept.
Absolutely not little. In October 1939, the Soviets summoned the Finnish delegation to Moscow and laid out terms that really amounted to a total capitulation of key sovereign territory.
What were the specifics?
Finland had to cede large territories on the Karelian Isthmus, which crucially contained their primary defensive fortifications, the Mannerheim Line. They also had to lease the strategic Hanko Peninsula down south for a Soviet naval base and dismantle all their existing border defenses. Basically, strip naked strategically.
And what was offered in exchange? I remember this part being almost insulting.
It was a vast but geographically useless tract of Soviet Karelia. It was mostly swampy, barren wilderness, technically twice the size of the land they demanded, but completely devoid of infrastructure, population, or any real strategic value.
So worthless land for their industrial heartland and defenses.
Exactly. It was an insult disguised as a negotiation.
This put the Finnish leadership in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, you had Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim,
A key figure.
deeply experienced military leader, a former Tsar's general, actually. He knew the realities of modern warfare. He looked at the vast discrepancy in men and material and saw that war was, by conventional standards, simply unwinnable.
He was the realist. He urged compromise, favoring giving up land to save the nation from destruction.
The Finnish public, and crucially the parliament, they were deeply scarred by their hard-won independence from Russia back in 1917. They just refused to compromise their sovereignty again.
That spirit of Sisu kicked in. It was non-negotiable for many. Foreign Minister Eljasarko captured that national defiant mood perfectly with his famous retort. "We will not yield, the dictator is bluffing."
He thought Stalin wouldn't actually invade.
Apparently so, or at least hoped he wouldn't push it that far. But that leads us to a crucial analytical question you raised. Was Stalin truly bluffing?
And the sources seem pretty clear on this.
They really do. Our sources confirm he absolutely was not bluffing. The evidence of his true aim, which was probably conquest or at least total subjugation, seems undeniable.
How so?
Well, Moscow had already established a puppet government in waiting. Cynically named the Finnish Democratic Republic, it was staffed with hardline Finnish communists like Otto Kuusinen, ready to be installed the moment Helsinki fell.
So this wasn't really about securing Leningrad's flank. It was about annexation from the start.
That seems to be the strongest interpretation of the evidence. The security concerns were real, but they likely served as a convenient pretext for a larger ambition.
Okay, so if annexation was the goal, he needed a justification, right? Some kind of excuse for the inevitable international outcry. He needed a casus belli, a pretext for war.
And he manufactured one quite masterfully in its cynicism on November 26th at the small border village of Manila.
The Manila Incident.
Exactly. Soviet reports immediately flooded the international press, claiming Finnish artillery had shelled the village of Manila, killing 4 Soviet border guards, instantly blaming Finland.
But a truth.
The immediate internal investigations by the Finns, and crucially, subsequent post-Soviet Russian admissions years later, revealed the dark, predictable truth. It was classic false flag operation.
So the Soviets shelled their own territory.
Yes. The shells were fired not by the Finns, who had actually pulled their artillery back from the border to avoid any accidental provocation, but by the NKVD, Stalin's own secret police. They killed their own soldiers to create the justification for invasion.
A casus belli written in the blood of his own men.
Yeah.
Chilling. Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, then delivered an ultimatum, right?
Immediately. Apologize for the attack you didn't commit, and withdraw your troops 25 kilometers from the border, effectively abandoning your defensive lines.
And the Finns, knowing they hadn't fired a shot.
They refused the ultimatum, obviously, but they did propose something quite reasonable, a joint international investigation into the incident.
Which the Soviets ignored, of course.
Completely. That refusal was the final green light Stalin needed. On November 28th, the Soviets officially denounced the 1932 Soviet-Finnish Non-Aggression Pact. 2 days later, November 30th, the invasion began. Soviet bombers appeared over Helsinki.
And here is where the stunning, just breathtakingly dark irony of Soviet propaganda reached new heights. Molotov, with incredible cynicism, told the world press that the Soviet Union wasn't dropping bombs on Helsinki at all.
What did he claim they were dropping?
He claimed they were dropping bread baskets for the starving Finnish people. Aid packages, essentially.
Bread baskets, while bombing civilians. The Finns, looking at the very real incendiary destruction raining down, had the perfect immediate retort. It defined the ingenuity of their resistance from day one.
They nicknamed the Soviet cluster bombs Molotov's bread baskets.
Exactly. And their immediate military reply to the invasion itself, the improvised weapon that became iconic.
The Molotov cocktail. A simple glass bottle filled with fuel, often gasoline mixed with tar, and a rag wick.
Turning the Soviet propaganda minister into the namesake of desperate, personal, and surprisingly effective resistance. It's quite something.
That invention, the Molotov cocktail, It really perfectly captures the improvised, almost ferocious spirit of the early war, doesn't it? Because that initial massive Soviet plan.
Yeah, the one designed for the open plains of Europe.
Right. A wide, broad front annihilation strategy.
Yeah.
It immediately began to unravel, didn't it, as soon as it hit the actual Finnish terrain?
Oh, completely. The terrain was truly Finland's first great defensive line. The Red Army marched into what was, logistically and geographically, just a white hell for them.
Not the European battlefield they expected.
Not at all. Finland wasn't a land of rolling fields perfect for tanks. It was a trackless expanse of deep snow, thousands of frozen lakes, incredibly dense pine forests, and hidden swamps. The few roads that existed were narrow, icy corridors. Often just a single file of trucks and tanks could pass.
Perfect for ambush.
Absolutely perfect. And this is where the contrast between the two armies was just starkest. You had Soviet soldiers, often conscripts pulled from the warmer regions like Ukraine or Central Asia.
So completely unprepared for the Arctic cold.
Totally. Dressed in standard khaki uniforms, freezing, struggling constantly just to get their equipment started. Sources mention their skin literally freezing to the metal of their rifles in the intense cold. Their heavy, mechanized equipment, their tanks, their trucks, just got immobilized by the cold and the snow.
And against them.
Against them stood the Finns, true masters of their environment. These were farmers, loggers, hunters. They were clad in white camouflage, moving almost silently on skis, able to traverse the dense forests at speed while carrying their own supplies.
Like ghosts.
Genuine ghosts of the forest. They were deeply familiar with every ridge, every frozen lake shore, every opportunity for concealment and ambush. They belonged there.
And this local knowledge, this mastery of the terrain, allowed for the crystallization of a tactical masterpiece. A strategy that fundamentally defeated the initial Soviet mechanized doctrine.
The motti.
Yes, motti. It's a Finnish word apparently named after a unit of stacked firewood in the local vernacular. And the strategy was essentially one of systematic dismemberment and starvation. Brilliant in its simplicity and utter lethality.
So let's break down how it actually worked. How did they execute a motti attack?
Okay, so Finnish ski patrols, relying on speed, silence, and surprise, would first pinpoint a massive Soviet column. These columns could be stretched for miles along a single, icy forest road, completely dependent on that road.
Vulnerable.
Extremely. The Finns would then launch a surprise attack, often at night, right on the front of the column. They'd aim to stall the advance, typically by targeting command vehicles, fuel trucks, or the lead tanks with explosives or those Molotov cocktails. So block the head of the snake.
Exactly. But crucially, they wouldn't just stall the front. Almost simultaneously, other ski units would move quickly behind the stalled force and cut the road far to the rear, often by blowing bridges or felling trees. This completely trapped the entire Soviet column in place.
Stranded.
Utterly stranded. The column became this huge, paralyzed snake of men and metal, totally reliant on that single thread of road for food, fuel, ammunition, everything. And that thread was now cut at both ends.
And then came the dissection, right? The slicing.
Yes. Once the column was immobilized and isolated, the Finns would launch smaller, relentless guerrilla attacks all along its length. They'd slice through the column at multiple points, breaking it up into smaller, isolated, unsupportable pockets. These pockets were the individual mottis, the firewood stacks.
And inside those pockets, what was the fate of the Soviet soldiers trapped there?
It was grim. Cut off from supply, especially food and fuel in that crushing cold, and often without vital medical aid, they were basically condemned to a frozen hell.
Their tanks, the symbol of Soviet might.
They'd quickly run out of fuel in the constant effort to keep engines from freezing solid. They became nothing more than fixed, useless steel pillboxes, easily targeted by Finnish anti-tank teams.
So the Finns didn't even have to launch costly frontal assaults on these pockets.
Often, no. They simply contained them. They'd set up blocking positions, use snipers to pick off anyone moving, and essentially let hunger, the freezing temperatures, and disease do the vast majority of the killing for them. It was brutal, efficient siege warfare on a micro scale.
There's that chilling motto that emerged from the fighting on the Kola front, wasn't there? It really sums up the determination.
Kola keste, Kola holds. It embodies that spirit. Hold your ground. Let the Arctic and your knowledge of it grind the enemy down.
But the textbook example, the most horrifyingly effective demonstration of this motti strategy, the one that really shocked the world, came at the Battle of the Great Road.
Ah, yes, near Suomussalmi. This is the story that became legendary across Europe almost overnight.
So set the scene. The Soviets sent two major formations, the 163rd Division and then the elite mechanized 44th Rifle Division.
Crack troops, supposedly. Ukrainians mostly in the 44th.
Right. Altogether over 20,000 men, maybe closer to 25,000 with support units. Their objective was strategically vital. Drive west and cut Finland cleanly in half at its narrowest point.
And they ran into Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo and his Finnish 9th Division. Initially, Silasvu was outnumbered something like 3-1.
How did he counter?
He was a tactical master. He actually let the initial Soviet 163rd advance quite deep, then skillfully cut them off, surrounded them, and eventually annihilated them in a series of mottes. But the real turning point, the focus of the Great Road Battle itself, was the arrival of the fresh 44th Division.
Which was sent to rescue the 163rd and punch through.
Exactly. But they, too, were forced to deploy along that single, narrow, heavily forested Great Road. It was a death trap waiting to happen.
And Silasvu sprang it. For how long did this go on?
For over a month, from roughly December 4th through to January 7th, 1940. Silasvu's smaller, highly mobile ski troops just systematically destroyed the entire 44th Division through relentless, slicing ambushes, creating multiple mottis along that road.
The statistics from this single battle, they're just mind-boggling. They really illustrate the catastrophic failure of the Soviet doctrine and the effectiveness of the Finnish tactics.
They're absolutely staggering. The Soviets lost, conservatively, over 9,000 men killed on that road alone. Some estimates go much higher. The Finns, in inflicting those losses and capturing vast amounts of equipment, they suffered roughly 400 casualties.
9,000 dead versus 400.
It wasn't really a battle in the conventional sense. It was more like a military execution dictated by the environment and superior adapted tactics.
And the aftermath.
Yeah.
The descriptions are less like a typical battlefield scene and more like some kind of bizarre, dark historical installation piece.
It sounds surreal. The road was apparently littered for miles with thousands of frozen corpses, often stacked like cordwood by the Finns just to clear the way. And amongst the hundreds of abandoned tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, they found something else.
The military band.
A full Soviet military band captured intact, complete with tubas, trumpets, drums, even stacks of sheet music, ready for the victory parade in Oulu, the city they were supposed to capture.
It's just a chilling, almost grotesque testament to the Soviet command's utter overconfidence, isn't it? Believing they'd just march through and play a victory concert.
It became a symbol of the whole disastrous initial campaign, a visible, undeniable, and deeply humiliating disaster for the Red Army. And adding to that psychological pressure, that constant dread, was the terror inflicted by another element of the Finnish defense.
The snipers.
Of course. The White Death. Simo Häyhä.
Probably the most famous sniper in history.
Arguably, yes. Häyhä was this unassuming, soft-spoken farmer. Interestingly, he preferred using simple iron sights on his rifle, not a telescopic scope.
Why was that?
Several reasons. Scopes could fog up or freeze in the extreme cold. The reflection of sunlight off the glass lens could give away his position. And using iron sights meant he could keep a lower profile. He didn't have to raise his head as much.
Smart, tactical, and effective.
Incredibly. To keep his silhouette minimal, he'd compact himself into snowdrifts, sometimes even packing the snow down with water to create an invisible, icy firing position. He put snow in his mouth, too, to stop his breath showing in the cold air.
The attention to detail is amazing, and his grim tally, it's almost mythical.
It really is. He is officially credited with over 500 confirmed kills of Soviet soldiers in less than 100 days of combat.
Over 5 kills a day, on average.
And some sources say on certain days he might have averaged closer to 25 kills. It's an almost unbelievable rate of attrition inflicted by one man.
He must have been relentlessly hunted by the Soviets.
Oh, absolutely. They sent counter-sniper teams, used artillery barrages on suspected positions. He was eventually badly wounded by an explosive bullet to the jaw in March 1940, which took him out of the war, but the impact was already made.
Because he and his comrades, the other Finnish snipers, they didn't just inflict casualties, did they? They inflicted psychological warfare.
Exactly, they killed morale. To the average Soviet soldier, the Finns were these terrifying ghosts that appeared out of the blinding snow, often targeted officers and commissars, first disrupting command, and then just vanished before anyone could even properly react.
So for the Soviet soldier already suffering terribly from the cold, probably near starvation in the mottes, maybe distrustful of their own leadership after the purges. Every snowdrift, every copse of trees became a potential icy grave.
It added another layer of constant fear and paranoia to an already nightmarish situation.
So by the end of January 1940, let's take stock. The massive Soviet offensive had stalled completely, hadn't it?
ground to a halt. The mighty Red Army, the largest in the world, had been fought to a standstill, even humiliated by a few thousand highly mobile, highly motivated soldiers on skis operating on their home terrain.
And that humiliation back in the Kremlin, it couldn't stand, could it? It demanded a bloody reckoning.
Absolutely. Stalin wasn't one to accept failure lightly.
Okay, so we enter what becomes the most brutal phase of the war. Section 3, the sledgehammer. That initial failure and the sheer scale of the humiliation, it was just too much for Stalin to bear.
Right. The sources talk about him being in a murderous rage. And that rage wasn't just directed outwards, it turned inwards too. It led to a renewed, cold, vicious targeting of the hapless generals who had planned and led this initial disaster.
More purges.
Yes, the purges within the military, which had already gutted the officer corps before the war, were reinvigorated. Heads rolled, forcing a fundamental change in leadership and, crucially, in doctrine.
The command structure was completely reorganized, wasn't it? Klement Voroshilov?
Yeah, the old Bolshevik stalwart, a political loyalist, but clearly a bumbling military commander in this context. He was out.
And in came Semyon Timoshenko.
A very different figure, described by the sources simply as a hard, competent soldier. Timoshenko wasn't necessarily a brilliant innovator, but he understood military basics, logistics, and crucially, he understood that the first plan relying on complex maneuvering and rapid mechanized advance had been a catastrophic failure in Finnish conditions.
So the shift marked the moment the Soviets essentially realized they couldn't necessarily fight smarter than the Finns in that environment.
Yeah.
So they had to fight bigger and just, relentlessly.
Precisely. They abandoned the sophisticated but failed maneuvers entirely. Instead, they focused everything on brute force and the terrible mathematics of attrition. Timoshenko concentrated nearly every available asset, men, tanks, aircraft, and especially artillery, onto a single terrifying objective, smashing through the Mannerheim line on the Karelian Isthmus. Forget finesse, just overwhelm.
This was the official adoption of the doctrine of accepted carnage, wasn't it? There's that chilling quote attributed to Timoshenko that sums up the new philosophy.
Yes, he reportedly stated it quite clearly, something like, "We will conduct a succession of direct attacks. We will constrain the enemy to lose blood. That is, to lose something he has in lesser quantity than we do."
Meaning soldiers?
Meaning soldiers, ammunition, everything, he continued. Of course, we will also suffer enormous losses, but in wartime, one must not count one's own losses, but those of the enemy.
That is the pure mathematics of superior manpower being used as expendable strategic capital. It's utterly chilling because it shows a complete, almost callous lack of concern for the individual soldier's life, only for the ultimate strategic outcome.
It's the logic of the Colossus finally deciding to just lean on its opponent until they break. And on February 1st, 1940, that new relentless attrition began in earnest.
The sources describe the assault as almost biblical in scale. The sky over the isthmus just turned to constant fire.
For 24 hours straight, a continuous rolling barrage of an estimated 300,000 shells fell upon the Finnish lines along the Mannerheim line. 300,000 shells in one day.
It's hard to even conceive of that level of bombardment. And this wasn't precision fire aimed at specific trenches, was it?
No, not initially. It was what military historians sometimes call geological fire. They used the largest guns available, including massive 203mm railway guns and heavy howitzers, designed not just to eliminate personnel, but literally to reshape the landscape. To pulverize fortifications, reduce bunkers to dust, collapse trenches, and bury entire defensive positions under tons of earth and snow. Just erase the targets.
But the brutality was now coupled with a newfound competence, wasn't it? It wasn't just mindless brute force this time. The Soviets had actually learned some critical lessons from those disastrous Motti defeats. They began to adapt quickly and effectively.
They really did. The changes implemented under Timoshenko were quite revolutionary for the Red Army at that specific moment. First, the simple things. They finally deployed proper winter camouflage, painting their tanks and soldiers white, like the Finns. Sounds obvious, but they hadn't done it initially.
Maybe.
Second, and perhaps most crucially, they stopped stretching their forces out in vulnerable columns and moved away from that overly centralized, rigid command structure that had plagued them. They started operating in smaller, more flexible, integrated, combined arms groups.
Combined arms, meaning tanks weren't just roaring ahead into the woods alone anymore, expecting infantry to catch up.
Exactly. That had been a disaster. Now, tanks, infantry squads, and specialized combat engineers work together intimately as a single tactical unit. The infantry supported the tanks directly, clearing finished anti-tank obstacles like log barriers or mines, dealing with hidden Finnish ski troops or snipers, and crucially, preventing the tanks from being isolated and picked off one by one, like in the Modus.
And the engineers.
The combat engineers were vital. They moved with the assault groups, clearing complex minefields under fire, blowing up Finnish bunkers the tanks couldn't destroy, and preparing routes for the advance. Teamwork, finally.
And maybe the most critical adaptation. They solved the communication breakdown that had crippled them earlier.
Massively improved. They vastly increased the use of field radios, coordinating attacks much better. And for the first time, artillery observers, guys with radios calling in targets, were permanently embedded with the frontline assault groups.
So the artillery, that geological fire, could now be directed with terrifying new accuracy.
Precisely. Instead of just blasting general map coordinates, these forward observers could call down fire directly onto specific Finnish bunkers, machine gun nests, or strong points the moment they revealed themselves or showed resistance. The response time became devastatingly fast.
These adaptations together, they meant the Soviets were still taking horrendous casualties, right? Timoshenko accepted that.
Oh, absolutely. The losses remained enormous, but now they were finally advancing with purpose. They were pushing the Finns back systematically, relentlessly.
And the Finnish defenders, meanwhile, they fought with the fury of the doomed, didn't they? But they were facing the inevitable.
They were physically exhausted after months of intense fighting, and their small industrial base simply couldn't compete with the sheer volume of shells, tanks, and fresh manpower the Soviets were pouring onto the isthmus.
Their biggest single crisis was ammunition, wasn't it?
Critically low on everything, but especially artillery shells, they just couldn't reply effectively to the Soviet barrages anymore. And the Mannerheim Line itself, Soviet propaganda loved to portray it as this impregnable fortress to excuse their early failures.
But it wasn't really like the Maginot Line or anything.
Not at all. It was a decent but finite series of concrete bunkers, trenches, and field fortifications, mostly built in the 1920s and 30s. It was well-sited and bravely defended, designed to buy time, but it relied absolutely on constant resupply and fresh reserves of manpower to hold.
Neither of which Finland possessed in sufficient quantity by February 1940.
Exactly. And on February 11th, after 10 solid days of that continuous hellish pounding and relentless combined arms assaults, the Soviets achieved a critical breakthrough. The line cracked at a village called Suma.
And once that happened,
the floodgates were effectively open. Mannerheim, the realist, facing the very real possibility of the total collapse and encirclement of his remaining forces, and realizing the enemy was finally applying overwhelming pressure effectively, authorized a general retreat from the mainline positions on February 15th.
They fell back, trying to establish new lines, but the Soviets didn't let up, did they?
No, Timoshenko maintained relentless pressure. They pursued vigorously. In a daring and decisive move, Soviet forces even crossed the frozen ice of Viipuri Bay in early March, successfully outflanking the last major Finnish defensive positions protecting Finland's second-largest city, Viipuri.
So by early March 1940, the overall situation for Finland was
catastrophic. Viipuri itself was falling, street by street. The army was exhausted, almost out of ammunition, and facing encirclement. And perhaps the most critical factor sealing their fate was Finland's complete diplomatic isolation.
They'd held on desperately, hoping for outside help, right? There was talk of a Franco-British expeditionary force.
There was. Plans were made. Troops were notionally allocated. Finland pinned its hopes on this intervention.
But that relief force, it remained a phantom, didn't it? Why didn't it arrive?
It was blocked entirely by neutral Sweden and Norway. They refused to grant transit rights for Allied troops across their territory, primarily because they feared German retaliation if they did.
Hitler had warned them off.
Implicitly and explicitly, yes. The threat of Germany potentially invading Scandinavia if Allied troops landed there was very real, and it effectively paralyzed any chance of direct Western military aid reaching Finland in time.
So Finland, having demonstrated impossible courage and tactical brilliance, stood utterly alone, facing total annihilation by the Soviet steamroller.
They had no choice left. They had to talk peace immediately on Moscow's terms.
Which brings us to the final chapter, Section 4. The victor's peace and the astronomical cost. Finland, facing imminent total military defeat and conquest, sent a delegation to Moscow. The Treaty of Moscow was signed on March 12, 1940, ending the 105-day war.
And the terms were brutal. Much harsher, in fact, than anything the Soviets had demanded before the war began. It felt punitive.
What did Finland lose specifically?
The treaty forced Finland to cede roughly 9% of its entire national territory. This included the strategically vital Karelian Isthmus containing the now-ruined Mannerheim Line, and crucially, Viipuri, the nation's second-largest city and a major Baltic port.
Huge economic losses, too, presumably.
Massive. They lost an estimated 30% of their pre-war economic assets. This included valuable industrial capacity, rich farmland, forests, and critical hydroelectric power generation facilities located in the ceded territories. And on top of all that, they still had to lease the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviets for a naval base for 30 years.
It sounds like a crushing, comprehensive defeat on paper. Economically, geographically, strategically.
It absolutely was a defeat, no question. But, and this is the crucial achievement, the thing that defines the legacy of this war and, in a way, justifies the immense sacrifice embodied by Sisu. Finland retained its sovereignty.
That's the key takeaway.
It's the absolute key. They were defeated, yes, but they were not annexed. They were not occupied wholesale. The Terjoki puppet government, Stalin's intended vehicle for political conquest led by Kusinin, it was quietly dissolved by Moscow as part of the peace. Finland paid a horrific price in land, assets, and blood, but they survived as an independent sovereign nation.
Which was a rare feat on the USSR's volatile borders during that era.
Extremely rare. Think about the Baltic states shortly after. Finland's survival as an independent entity is remarkable in context.
And the human toll. It really underlines both the sheer inefficiency and strategic folly of the initial Soviet operation, but also the stark, brutal efficiency of the Finnish defense, doesn't it?
It really does. Finland suffered over 25,000 dead and many more wounded, a staggering loss for such a small population, proportionally huge.
But the Soviet price for this Pyrrhic victory is astronomical. Initial Soviet figures released at the time were laughably low propaganda numbers.
Completely unbelievable. But modern Russian historical estimates, based on access to archives, place the Red Army dead somewhere between 130,000 and 170,000 men killed in action or died of wounds or frostbite.
130 to 170,000 dead.
Yes. And beyond the dead, you have over 300,000 Soviet soldiers who were wounded or suffered severe frostbite, often requiring amputation or leading to permanent disability. The total casualties were probably close to 500,000 men.
Let that sink in for a moment for our listeners. If you put those numbers side by side, the Soviets suffered more men killed, just killed, than the entire Finnish army had fielded in the first place.
It's an absolutely stunning casualty ratio. It shows just how effectively the Finns, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, managed to bleed the Colossus dry, especially in those first couple of months.
And that catastrophic bloodletting, that exposure of Red Army weakness followed by its brutal adaptation, it had immediate, devastating global ripple effects, didn't it? Most notably, perhaps, in Berlin.
Absolutely. Which brings us to Section 5, the global ripple effect and legacy. We've established that Adolf Hitler over in Germany was watching the unfolding Winter War with intense, focused interest.
But the question is, was he watching the whole war? Or just the parts that confirmed what he wanted to see? What conclusion did he draw from that early Soviet humiliation back in December 1939 and January 1940?
He drew exactly the conclusion his pre-existing ideological bias demanded. Hitler watched the Finns executing the motti victories, saw the Red Army stalled in the Snore, witnessed the chaotic command structure and the massive equipment losses, and it confirmed his deepest, most fervent ideological belief that the Red Army was, and this is a quote often attributed to his thinking at the time, a headless colossus of clay, rotten to the core.
So he saw it as confirmation of the inherent weakness he perceived in the Slavic race and the Bolshevik political system.
Precisely. It fit his narrative perfectly. The Finns, whom he considered racially closer to his Aryan ideal, were easily holding off the subhuman Slavic masses led by incompetent communists. It proved his theories right in his mind.
And here is the historical blind spot, isn't it? The staggering, lethal tragedy that ultimately doomed millions more people just over a year later. The second phase of the war.
Right. The stunning Soviet recovery under Timoshenko, the successful shift to brutal attrition warfare, the effective use of combined arms tactics, the terrifying artillery coordination that ultimately did break the Mannerheim Line and forced Finland to sue for peace.
That whole operational adaptation, that learning curve shown in February-March 1940, it went almost entirely unnoticed, or perhaps was deliberately dismissed by German military intelligence.
Largely, yes. Their main intelligence assessment corps, Foreign Armies East, FHO, had filed a truly damning report on the Red Army on December 31st, 1939. It was based entirely on the initial chaotic Soviet failures. It painted a picture of utter incompetence, poor leadership, low morale, terrible equipment.
And they never significantly updated that assessment.
Sources suggest they rarely, if ever, substantially revised that initial negative report to reflect Timoshenko's subsequent military learning and eventual success in forcing a victory, albeit costly, in February and March 1940. Why would they? Why look for evidence of Soviet strength or adaptability when the initial failure perfectly confirmed your leader's pre-existing ideological assumptions about their weakness?
That catastrophic failure of intelligence, driven by ideology, had a direct, terrifying consequence, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The Winter War, specifically the interpretation of its early phase, essentially convinced Hitler that the Soviet Union would crumble easily under one sharp, decisive kick, just like Finland almost did, only on a much larger scale.
So this grossly flawed confidence, born from misreading the Winter War, was the tipping point that led directly to the serious, accelerated, and ultimately hubristic planning of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941.
Yes, he genuinely believed, based in large part on the Red Army's perceived performance against Finland, that the war in the East would be over in a matter of months. He disastrously underestimated their resilience, their industrial capacity, and crucially their ability to learn and adapt, which the Winter War, ironically, had forced them to begin doing.
And for Finland itself, surviving the Winter War, retaining its independence, led paradoxically to a tragic, almost existential strategic dilemma, didn't it?
It really did. They were deeply wounded, economically shattered, politically isolated, and understandably desperate to reclaim their lost Karelian lands and regain some measure of strategic security against their massive, threatening neighbor.
So they looked around for potential allies.
And they realistically assessed that the only power in Europe, potentially strong enough and perhaps willing to stand up to the Soviet colossus, was Nazi Germany.
Which led directly to that unavoidable, deeply uncomfortable, tragic alliance of convenience, as historians often call it.
Exactly. It led directly to Finland becoming a co-belligerent, not formally an Axis member, but fighting alongside the Third Reich in what the Finns call the War of Continuation, starting in June 1941, essentially riding the coattails of Barbarossa to try and reclaim their lost territory.
A painful, pragmatic decision born directly out of the consequences of the Winter War and the price they paid to retain their independence in 1940.
It was an agonizing position for them. Looking at the larger legacy then for the USSR, the Winter War, despite the eventual victory, was a near-fatal warning sign, wasn't it?
A wake-up call paid for in blood.
A very bloody wake-up call. Timoshenko's reforms, forcing the adoption of combined arms tactics, demanding better logistics and winter preparation, improving command and control, especially artillery coordination, these changes, though incredibly costly and far from complete by 1941, crucially allowed the Red Army to begin learning how to fight the massive, brutal, mechanized war that Hitler was planning.
So that learning curve, that painful adaptation forced upon them in the Finnish snow, arguably helped save the Soviet Union from total collapse 2 years later when Barbarossa hit.
It certainly played a significant role. They were still caught off guard in many ways, but they weren't the same disorganized force that invaded Finland in 1939. And for Finland, what's the enduring legacy there?
For Finland, the Winter War became the nation's defining modern epic. It's often referred to as a sacred war, a foundational event that preserved their independence against truly impossible odds.
The myth, or perhaps the reality, of the Winter War of Sisu, of the white-clad ski soldier defying the giant, it cemented itself as the cornerstone of modern Finnish national identity. It helped establish that unique global position Finland held for decades, one of stoic neutrality, fierce independence, and determined self-reliance.
It really stands as this enduring lesson, doesn't it? That national will, that Sisu, when fused with intimate knowledge of terrain and clever tactical genius, can, at least temporarily, defy the coldest, hardest logic of industrial numbers and brute force.
And that powerful image brings us to our final thought for you today. The source material consistently emphasizes how German intelligence, effectively blinded by Hitler's powerful ideological bias, focused almost entirely on the chaotic Soviet failures of December 1939 and January 1940.
Right, they saw the initial disaster.
And they effectively ignored or downplayed the rapid, crucial adaptation and the ultimate grinding military victory secured by Timoshenko just weeks later in February and March 1940. That ideological bias, that confirmation bias, cost them and the world almost everything.
It really raises a vital, maybe uncomfortable question for us today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially in our modern world, saturated with information, disinformation, and deeply entrenched ideological beliefs on all sides.
That's a question.
How often in history, and perhaps more importantly, in our own contemporary conflicts, political debates, and strategic calculations, are massive decisions made based not on comprehensive current data that might show an adversary's adaptation, recovery, or unexpected strength,
But instead, based on an initial, perhaps flawed assessment that simply confirms what we already desperately want to believe about our adversaries or about the situation.
It's the constant insidious danger of confirmation bias, elevated to the level of grand strategy, isn't it? Hitler wanted the Red Army to be rotten to the core, so when evidence started emerging that maybe it wasn't quite so rotten, or at least was learning fast.
He and his intelligence apparatus effectively stopped looking or interpreted the new data through the old lens. It is a powerful, cold lesson from the Winter War. A lesson in the vital importance of critical observation, intellectual humility, and the terrible, terrible cost of underestimating your enemy's ability to learn, adapt, and endure. Something to think about.